Alrighty. Great games at your table. This is Jonathan Albin, and this is Game Master's Soapbox. As you may recall, we have been bouncing back and forth between the specifics of uh, the Game Master Soapbox, where I pontificate and give my opinions on things concerning roleplay games, and the Nycos News Network. So we will probably be doing a little bit of both of that tonight. And so tonight we're going to be looking at the reasons why I have, even though I'm broadcasting in the D&D channel, I have left Dungeons and Dragons as a role-playing engine after 48 years. This last January, I launched into the ninth iteration of the storytelling arc of the World of Nycos, the adventure that I tell every year, as the games that I run. Pardon me. And the primary reason for making this change falls into a bunch of different categories, and so I'll be talking about looks like 8 or 9 or 10 of them today. And I'm sure that this can go from being a monologue to a dialogue pretty quickly. So if you have deep set opinions and want to share those with me, I'll be glad to respond to them. My primary reason for leaving Dungeons and Dragons after this entire time is that I have been dealing with a challenge with the combat system for decades and had not figured out a useful mechanism until sometime about 2 years ago, and started playing with ideas and options. And when I finally made the transition to the NycosRPG mechanism, it was because I had finally quantified it, put it into writing, and had shared it in the NycosRPG rules. Now, the rules for the game have been published for coming up on a year or so now since I first sent it to my printer, but they've been utilized in playtest for the last couple of years. And the reason for that, the overall change, was that there were enough variances between what I recall playing when I was younger and the way the game is being presented now, that I finally decided I had to break off the standard rules. Now, this was, I was afraid it would be a big challenge for my players, but it ended up being about the smoothest transition as ever, because we were moving from a clunky, poorly devised system to one that took almost 50 years to develop. So the primary reasons, though, that I left are listed here. And before we get to those, I want to thank you for joining us here on Twitch. I've been broadcasting here for the better part of 3 years, and I greatly appreciate you. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you can. Also, make sure you follow so that you get updated every time we hang on just a second. I got to take something mechanically. Here we go. So, having said that, if you are a fan of the show and want to become involved with it, you can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Nycos. And of course, if you were looking for a copy of the game, you can find it at lulu.com and look up NycosRPG, or you can also find it for ordering on my website, NycosRPG.com. Alrighty, so as we launch into this, we're going to be going over each of these points one at a time, and if you have any response to them, I'll be glad to engage with them. The first one is that the agenda of the property Dungeons & Dragons has shifted. When the game was originally devised, it was an engine for creators and storytellers to tell their own stories, and the products that were provided were supplements or additional materials that could be used to perhaps fill gaps or advance or adapt the story that the game master was telling, but it was never, at least it was not originally or initially set up to be telling the storytellers what stories to tell. Instead, they were saying, if you're doing a fantasy setting, if you're doing a medieval period with magic and stuff, here are some rules that can be used for doing role play. And they were the first, and they were the big dog on the block, and they were the most expansive. They covered basically all the bases, and so their purpose was to just enhance the idea of role play in general and provide an opportunity and a way to do those communications. As time went by, the agenda has changed to the point where they are actively attempting to corner the market on their intellectual property, and that's perfectly valid. That certainly is the case if the purpose was to run an adventure within the realm of the framework that they had created, then yes, they should have every right to lock in and modify and maintain controls on the intellectual property. But the very concept of role playing and the very mechanisms that they used were not by any stretch unique or even really logically linkable. And so there, with the agenda of the property shifting, and since my game mechanics, my gameplay has never been within the framework of the Faerun realm and the adventuring realms of the different worlds, Eberron and such that they've developed, I've always been on the outside of that, and so it was not comfortable for me to remain playing a game that was in trying to enforce those kinds of agendas. And so therefore I moved away from it specifically to avoid dealing with the conflicts of propriety and property. The next is there's been a radical shift in the way roleplay games are participated in from the player base, partially because it's been an expanded audience and there are more people with other alternatives and other ways of thinking than were originally embraced. But the function of it was a shift from story to the player character advancement. And this mechanically leads to a change in the way the storyteller is expected to respond to player action. And this focus shift and this need for player advancement to take the foreground was something that I simply didn't want to deal with. I have, for decades, used a milestoning experience system, and it's now, in the newest regime, it's instantaneous awards and things like that. And I have no problem with advancing awards at all. As a matter of fact, the NycosRPG. Hello, welcome, welcome. I am on the air, and you are on the air with me. Who is with me tonight? Hey, it is Abletop. How you doing, Scott? How are you doing today? Alrighty. So, what's that? Well, okay. So the topic is why I left Dungeons and Dragons as a mechanic. Why I switched to Nycos RPG after almost 50 years with the property. And so I'm going through the points that I saw that needed to be changed. And so I know this is an ongoing conversation that you and I have bumped into before. So I'm sure you have rather strong opinions on some of these. So just so you know where we've gone so far, so catch you up since you're just now hopping on with this. The first one is that the agenda of Dungeons and Dragons and its owners at Hasbro has been to shift away from the property as a game master tool to a storytelling mechanism. For them, they are developing an intellectual property that they want to uh, showcase, and they're moving away from supporting individual creators, and as a matter of fact, kind of pushing them to play within the framework of their own mechanism. And that's one of the primary reasons why I'm moving to NycosRPG is to avoid uh, violating their creativity requirements. The second one that I mentioned was the one we're talking about right now, which is the advancement. And that was the change. That was the mechanism whereby the new nowadays players really want to gain their experience points instantaneously because the new D&D format using Beyond allows for them to do advancement moment by moment as they gain experience, and so they want to be awarded instantaneously so they can advance their characters as quickly. And rather than utilizing their mechanism for doing that, I'm utilizing the Nycos RPG system, which automates the process and lets the players pursue their own advancement. So now you're caught up with where we sort of are. Do you want to respond to either of those points, or shall I continue? Okay. That's fair. You have I will allow you to reserve your right to respond to any of these after the fact anyway, because you may not, have formed your defense or your argument for or against any of these. So we're moving on. The third one was that there have been a radical elimination of options for role playing in Dungeons and Dragons, especially over the last iteration. This fifth edition basically undermined and undercut and in some cases eliminated the way players might play their characters by removing from the pool certain classes or shifting them to the point of obscurity. I'm speaking in particular of the way they handled rogues, the change in the way paladins react to gods and clerics and their interactions, how they've undermined and eliminated a lot of the ambiance that was associated with specifically what was the originally called the thief class, but was later called the rogue class, and how they've basically eviscerated the methods of playing those characters to the point where they are not even recognizable any longer. For example, a lot of the mechanism that led people towards playing bards was based on the very concept that they have to start as low class rogues, move up to respectable warriors, and then eventually become minstrels instead of arbitrarily starting right off the bat with a musical instrument. And while it's not a bad thing per se, it is a major change in the role play and therefore affects the way people play their characters. Do you see that, or would you have a yeah? You seem to you seem to be responding to that one a little bit. Right. Well, that's well, you'll see what I mean in particular when I get to this next one. I've written it out as emphasis on the wrong syllables, but I prefer to say it the way that I say it when I mean it, and that is emphasis on the wrong syllable. We have moved from playing a rogue to be played as a dashing swordsman like thief, which is where it was originated. The idea of Robin Hood or Ivanhoe, any of the Errol Flynn kind of characters. Of course, in today's world, they don't even know who Errol Flynn is anymore. But this change in the game mechanic changed the emphasis of the game, and therefore it's not the same game that I started playing. As a matter of fact, it was only in this last year or so when I started to realize that when certain people that you and I both know made it clear that what I was thinking about what the game should be played like was not what other people were playing. And it was because the rules had basically obviated the course that I was trying to guide people towards. So having this change in emphasis has fundamentally changed the game away from where I was playing, where I had always been, my wheelhouse, so to speak. And so therefore it almost became necessary to change out of the combat system and the rule system because it no longer suited exactly. Does that make sense? Right, right. And you have extensive experience with other systems as well. And so you don't hold the line, so to speak, on what is stupid commercials. Yes, they happen every half an hour. So let me know when we're clear of them because I can't see that that page right now. Okay, so the my challenge with it isn't so much that I can't play around the rules. It's like I've been playing with the rules as written, and I used to be big time rules as written when I first started. But as the systems kept adapting and changing, and each time taking away some agency, moving things around so that they would actually change the focus of the game, it got to the point where they were so far off of what I was doing that it really wasn't any longer the game that I started with, if that makes sense. And so the idea of moving to a new system, what was that? I don't know. You're the one trying to say it. Yeah, and I'm not talking about necessarily one particular system over another. I'm just saying why I left D&D because D&D left us, so to speak. It was no longer the same property. And this actually, well, okay, but so therefore you're actually sort of in the same vein I am at this point. My next point is that there's been an active reduction in storytelling autonomy. The properties as written have become mandated if you want to continue. So in other words, if you buy a certain product, let's say go back to an example of Sword Coast, one of the very first advances in the fifth edition was the inclusion of the Sword Coast manual as the very first supplement. But in order to play Phandelver, you fundamentally had to fundamentally know a lot about the Sword Coast. You had to know the places and the locations and the names, and that reduced the ability for a storyteller to place. Go ahead. Right, and that's what I'm saying is that if you ran it as written, you were running it in Faerun. The names and the locations and such are located on a map in Faerun. So if you are going to continue to play that, then if some player says, "Oh, I saw some really cool information in the Sword Coast about Phandelver, about the area or whatever," then you're almost mandated to play along with that information, unless you are so abrupt that you say to a player, "Oh, that's not in my version of Phandelver," and now you have to, quote, now you have to embrace the idea of the homebrew. You have to say that you're not playing Dungeons and Dragons anymore. You're playing your version, which is, that I get. What I'm getting at, I guess, is that the change in attitude towards a homebrew was kind of stark. That there was no, I don't recall, for example, in second edition or even in third edition, any real focus on where your adventure was set. Your adventure was your adventure. So if you were on Nikos or if you were on Faerun, there was nobody really cared. It was only later. Hello, hello, and welcome, welcome. We are on the air. This is Jonathan Alvin, and this is NycosRPG. Who's with us now? I'm quiet. I'm actually broadcasting, so I'm hearing myself okay over the microwave there, a microwave. So maybe I turned my volume down too low on Discord. Let me go ahead and check that real quick here. Just a second. I did it. Well, okay. Well, that's probably because I'm so loud. Well, I just went over and added additional volume on Discord. All right. Well, I'm always good. I'm always amazing, but that's not what we're talking about right now. So we are talking about why I left Dungeons and Dragons as a mechanism. I know we're on the D&D channel, and some people may balk at that, but roleplay is roleplay, and Dungeons and Dragons is my root. And this conversation is really about D&D, so that's the reason why we're broadcasting here. But oh yeah, what's the real reason? Smart Alec. Oh, no. That's a deeper story than you know. They didn't just disregard my module; they discarded my world. But that was when I was 17, so that was a while ago. I'm not still holding a grudge for that. But thank you for mentioning that. We will. Oh yeah. Anyway, we're actually talking about the particular reasons, and I've gone through about five of them so far. Strigly. By the way, folks, Strigly is a good friend of the show, and he's been off and on communicating with us from the faraway land known as New Zealand. He's what's that? You've been my friend since the first session, pretty much. That's we could actually be more honest than that. You were the day they burned down my Discord, so you were there to. Yeah, I know. As I was saying, you were here before the Discord burned down. Yeah, so. Oh, nice. Now we know who piled the wood. All right, that is a whole joke there. I'll tell you that joke a little bit later. But we are to the point of talking about how the Dungeons and Dragons Fifth Edition kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back because they caused the active reduction in storytelling autonomy. Because if you bought property for their game, it was setting you up to play within their framework and their world and their worldview and their perceptions, and therefore, sure. Well, simple. Yeah, okay. You can use the word simplify in this case. Like you could say simplify a rifle and turn it into a Nerf gun. It's a radical change in the mechanism that makes it a simpler to play rules as written, but it does not make it as creative a resource for entertainment. So, in other words, yes, you can definitely understand things better by being able to point at a map and say, okay, we're in Fandelver, and if we want to go to um, Baldur's Gate, we can look on a map and see which direction it is, and by rules, we can know how many days it's going to be. Blah blah blah. But that does not improve storytelling autonomy. As a matter of fact, it restricts storytelling autonomy because I, as a game master, can't say, okay, you got on your horse and you're in Baldur's Gate. They can, and just move on because the theory of the game is that a player using rules as written will say, well, I've traveled this many months, and so therefore, based on the amount of experience points you've been earning, I should be this level now. There's right. Mm-hmm. Right. Great. Mm-hmm. Motion. Right. A hand gesture. Right. this is giving somebody a finger, but it's not the finger you're thinking. The, well, right. Well, right, right. For a visual example, you can think of in the movie Dune. There are several different times when uh, uh, the character does hand gesture to send a message, and it shows the text down below. That there's actually a word for that, and for NycosRPG, I'm now utilizing the word broadly, but the term chronomy, chronomy, means a language unspoken with hand gestures. So, so a Well, again, this is established though in Dungeons and Dragons that thieves' cant is the language used by thieves to convey information. So technically, if those two members were members of the guild, they would be using thieves' cant, a thieves' cant. The issue I get that, but you are living in a world where a player does have a right to ask you that because in the rules of the game, two thieves conveying information are using thieves can't. But but no, what I'm saying though is in D&D 5e it is formalized. Thieves can't is that language. There isn't then there's no way to convey information with hand gestures. It is. Well, no. That's now you're. I know. But see, you are therefore stepping outside of the rules of the game. No. Right. Well, okay. So you know that, I know that, but what I'm saying is in Dungeons and Dragons as a game, the sign language that occurs between two rogues is thieves' cant, no matter what. And yes, you would be able to. I, I get it. I get it, but I also would argue that I would see how a player could argue that, hey, that those that language, the unspoken language, doesn't have any other term in Dungeons and Dragons by rules. There is no other place where that is used. Okay, no, I right. Okay, so yeah, just for clarification, there are no rules to cover sign language like that. There's no sign language skill, for example, but there is T-scan. So technically, any hand gesture should be at least there should be at least a chance they would be able to interpret part of it. But there's no rules. There are no rules in D&D to handle that at all. So therefore, you're having to homebrew, and that's why the D&D reduction in storytelling autonomy is a dangerous thing, and that's why one of the reasons why I left the property is because there are no rules for it. Well, it, yeah, but what I'm going to show, we can go through 1,000. You were fine. You're fine. You from a GM standpoint, you're fine. From a Dungeons and Dragons rule system, there would be half of the game masters out there would tell you you're done wrong and you need to let them have a chance to intercept the message because it is a sign language and the only sign language in D&D is Thieves' Cant. But anybody else in the world, any other game master, go, don't worry about it, don't sweat it, and you're fine. So don't worry about it. But the next point where I depart from Dungeons and Dragons and had to move away from it is the misdirection of the focus on legacy that is now rampant within Dungeons and Dragons properties, and this goes from Xanathar's to Tasha's to Mordenkainen to Bigby. They have intentionally misdirected the history of the D&D franchise for their own purposes and thereby have undermined the very world that was created by the designers way back when. They are. To remember, it is a role-playing game. And Dungeons and Dragons was an open frame game to be used, but it wasn't. What I'm getting at is that it was originally open frame, so you could build anything you want to. It was a scaffold. It was a anchor that you could hang everything from. And no, it's no longer that. It is now a forming, developing franchise, title, branded, copyrighted, defined world, just as much as Lord of the Rings is the world of J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, okay, there's a problem with VTT, and I talked about in an earlier video about the fact that any VTT, any property that isn't being played in Theater of the Mind, technically is already independently franchised. It already is independently. That is what's called an intellectual property. Once you give a picture of what things look like, you have taken away agency. You've taken away creativity, and you've replaced it. But in their VTT, you can't even import miniatures. You can't import images right now. I just saw a video from. I think in their system you can only do that if you're a game master. So yeah, but a player can't. Player has to. They're wanting to move, whether they've accomplished it yet or not. They are moving. Right. Yeah, but see, the issue is that they are moving towards where they can. Where you, let's say, you choose a certain image, and they go, but if you want to spend an extra couple of bucks, the magical items he carries are going to scintillate, or his hair is going to wave in the breeze because we'll do some extra software for a few extra dollars because they're moving towards other ways to monetize. They flat out have said that they think the D&D brand is under monetized, and so they're going to do what they can to soak more money out of the players. And I think what you're going to see is that your ability to create characters and persona is going to be A, limited, and B, not as palatable to a player because he can get his model to be shiny and sparkly, and when he actually casts fly, he'll fly, and that kind of thing that you won't be able to do with the mods you're able to upload because they're not going to give you control for those things. That's what I just perceive in the future. And yeah, I think you're right that the VTT is going to be breaking a lot of things because the world that they're creating is their world. That that's what I'm saying. No, I'm agreeing with you. That's what, again. But my focus on this specific point is talk about their legacy of the names that they have access to, the things that are in their brand. So, for example, Mordenkainen and Big B. These are persona that existed in the D&D franchise going all the way back to first iteration. I mean, when D&D first came out in first and second edition, there were spells that had names like Big B's interposing hand or whatever. And those spells were written that way because they were identified and recognized to be part of a story. And what they're doing now is they're misdirecting that. And for example, Mordenkainen's goal in life was to become he was a wizard who wanted to be a fighter. And so he learned spells or created spells that would allow him to have things that a fighter or a champion or a warrior could have. Sure. Mm-hmm. It did some, sure, because that was when second edition died and third edition started. No, no, no. That's a major change right there. Because in second edition, you still had two hit armor class 0. You still had negative armor classes instead of positive armor classes. You still had initiative based on speed factor. You had initiative that had to be rolled every turn. They radically changed the rules when it from second edition to third edition. Matter of fact, there were people that thought the game was broke when they broke the world back then, to the point. No, that's not why it got changed. Armor class has always been armor class, but they reversed the charge. They reversed the sign on the front of the number. So you would, if you found armor, it would say it is +5 armor, but when you wrote it on your character sheet, you subtracted 5 from your armor class. Your armor class got. Okay, now we're talking about something completely different. We're talking about something completely different. And no, you don't got to give them anything. Ask Scott, how many magic items have I handed out in my games ever? And I'm not talking about not don't get me wrong, they have magical items, but do I give them magical items that modifies their numbers? Not really. I give them magical items that are useful, that are functional. Go ahead, Scott. I interrupted you. Go ahead. Well, and I'm not even talking about that, guys. What I'm talking about is that the mechanism for determining your armor class changed. In second edition, they used a mathematical formula called THACO, or two hit armor class 0. And when you played D&D, you fundamentally had to memorize that calculation, because what you needed to know is what you needed to hit armor class 0, and then looking at the die roll that you made, you could determine the actual armor class of your opponent. And so you did this little piece of math every time you rolled the dice. And so you could determine, okay, this monster has an armor modifier of this or whatever. And that armor class number was measured from a brick wall being a 10 and a fully armored suited guy to being a 20. So to hit armor class 0 would almost, in all cases, started at 20. And then the numbers would modify from that downward. So if you're in chainmail, your armor class is a 6. And that you're like, why is it a 6? Well, the armor class 6, you would be able to calculate that from a 20, it's going to be 14 down, so I know I need a 14 to hit. And so by being able to do that quick math of knowing that your armor classes are low numbers and your attack numbers are high numbers, you could do calculations really quickly. And you didn't have to have a grid chart for determining things. All you had to know is at the rate at which your character's numbers went down. So if you were a rogue, you went down 1 on THAC0 every 4 levels. But if you were a fighter, you went down every other level. And so therefore you could get to a THAC0 of, 14 pretty quickly as a fighter, but it would take you half of your character's life to get down to a 14 as a rogue because it just took longer to descend that grid. But that changed when they went to 3rd edition, because when we went to 3rd edition, they said players are not smart enough to use THAC0. Players, therefore, should be able to see their armor value as a plus number, and therefore now a +5 suit of armor, if you were wearing chainmail, is an 11 instead of a 6. It was simpler with a single piece of math because you could do any equation. Now each individual character's numbers varies based on what they have for equipment. And so you can't know generally what a monster is going to have. And that's just one example. There have been a ton of different changes. Going away from a percentile-based system for skills was another major change. Getting rid of the percentiles for strength modification beyond 18. Just going to a straight 18, 19, 20. That's a major change. And all of it really comes down to fan service from an organization that is no longer focused on seeing their fan as the game master, but seeing the game master as a necessary evil to reach their fans. And so therefore they're trying to streamline the game master core. And that's why a lot of game masters have quit GMing altogether, because it's too much of a burden to have to live in the world of Faerun and have to run things away. Yes, I get that. And you've been GMing, and you have been GMing less than 20 sessions, right? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You are that kind of a challenge won't happen to you really until you've got players who have been playing Dungeons and Dragons for a long time, and they know the world better than you do. And that's where you'll run into it, is that the players who... Yes. Yeah. Real simple one. Trolls. A troll, by definition, is what? That's a good pun. Sure, you could put your troll under a bridge, but what is deep? What are they? What are the? What are trolls? Hang on. What are trolls? They're 9 feet tall. They're green. They've got like warts and molds all over their face, and they regenerate every round unless the damage is done by fire. But what I'm getting at is that is a troll by Dungeons and Dragons rules. But in particular, it is also associated with the locale on Faerun. So if you're telling a story and you're describing a fight with a troll to the players, and they know you're running a story that is allegedly associated with it. Faerun is the name of the Dungeons and Dragons fantasy world. Forgotten Realms is the story that was told about people who lived in Faerun. Forgotten Realms is to Dungeons and Dragons the way Lord of the Rings is to Middle Earth. Middle Earth is the realm that the adventure occurs in. In the case of Dungeons, because it's streamlined and it's controllable. It's streamlined, controllable, and everybody's playing the same thing. It's like, why do you go to McDonald's? You go to McDonald's because the sandwiches are made exactly the same way no matter where you go. So you know with confidence what that food is going to be like. So in the same way that franchise works, Dungeons and Dragons wants you to play in Faerun and run the stories as they would have you run it, so that every player experience is identical, so that they don't have to credit or award or recognize the value of a storyteller or a game master. And therefore, you as a game master become a service tool for maintaining fan service for their fan base, which isn't you. It's them. It's the player. So that if somebody comes and plays in your game and they've been so used to playing, like a great example, there's a process called Adventures League. Have you heard of it? Adventures League is a organized play system devised by Dungeons and Dragons, by Hasbro, to get, yeah, not the Scots had any implications there, but the idea is that the rules of Adventure League is, if you want product support from Hasbro for the games you're running at your game store, you will have your game masters agree to play under that rule. And the Adventure League rules are: you are running in one of our canon worlds. You are on Faerun. You are in, oh God, what are the other ones that they still have? They got rid of Greyhawk. They Eberron, Dark Sun, Ravensloft. No, they don't have Greyhawk anymore. Greyhawk went out with the other designer. So the world of Greyhawk is no longer canon. But each world has its canon and its rules, and if you're going to play an Adventures League, you must play on that world. So if they run an adventure and it's a vampire themed adventure, it has to adhere to the rules of Ravensloft, because that is what they. You as a game master would know that and be bored with it. You as a player wouldn't know that, and you'd be playing on the in the world that you came to play in. And the issue is that the storyteller is now bound to the story that they want you to run. And this actually, yes, Robbie, welcome tonight. Yes, and this is why Nycos exists. But that's the thing, that they reduce the storyteller autonomy. They focus it this way. They misdirect the focus on legacy so that it's not like, for example, they did a huge change when they released Volo's Guide. Do you even know who Volocamp Gedarm is? That's the book. But do you know Volocamp Gedarm? Volocamp Gedarm. Have you ever heard that name before? That is Volo. Volocamp Gedarm is his name. He is a character in the Faerun story. And therefore, he is telling you what happens on Faerun. Therefore, if you use anything from Volo's Guide, you are agreeing tacitly to be playing in Faerun. Now, that's not who he was. You're going, I don't know what this guy is. Well, unless you had read any of the Forgotten Realms novels, you would never heard of Volo. He just wouldn't have existed. He was a created. Yeah, yeah, because when a player, you give him an item from Volos, he can go look it up in Volos and tell you how it works because it's in the rules as written. And if you move to rule of cool and you create your own stuff, now you're not a D&D game master. You're not a dungeon master. Not if you're going to run Adventure League. So what I'm getting at is not if you want their support. Because in order to get some, oh, they bring you players. You go to the game store and you say, yes, exactly. Yep, yep. And you, that's by the store. That's by the store. By agreement, though, Scott, you're not intend. It's not intentional for you to take their player base and move them off of their franchise. That's the problem. Because if you run a game and you say, "Yeah, well, this time we're going to be using my rules, my home rules," you have violated the agreement because you agreed you would play by the rules of their property. Come on, be that guy, Scott. Own it. Own it. Put on your armor. No, because okay, I'll give you an example. At Board Game Paradise, it flat out says in the write up for Monday and Tuesday games that Jonathan Albin is teaching beginner role playing. We are using the NycosRPG system. It is still called Monday Night D&D, but they say that flat out, and they also use D&D as the letters instead of the D ampersand D, just because they do. But Monday night and Tuesday night role playing doesn't ever say I'm Adventures Guild. But if I was there wanting to get new players for Dungeons and Dragons, I would have to agree to play Adventure League. Well, right, right. But but if they play in my Monday or Tuesday game and they get a character built for that game, they will be sorely disappointed the first time they show up at a D&D session that I'm not running because the character they have won't even make sense to a DM because it's not a D&D character sheet. That's why I have to advertise the way I do. Why I have to say it's a role play game, fantasy role play game like Dungeons and Dragons. But I don't say the like D&D part anymore because I don't need to because everybody knows what an RPG is for the most part. They don't realize they don't realize how many different genres they could be playing in, but they do know what an RPG is. Most people, no, no, the concept that I do, a theater of the mind, will forever exist because the concept of playing with other people who are telling the stories is attractive on its own. And so the computers will come out just as there are people who still race buggies today with their horses. There's still steeplechase competitions. They don't go away just because then something new comes along and you have NASCAR. That doesn't mean go-kart racing went away. You see what I'm saying? So I don't see that as an issue. But what I do see is a move away from a branded franchise when the brand then tells you what you can run and tells you what you can't, because that isn't storytelling anymore. Yes, and you can only use these 19 colors. Yep, exactly, exactly. Um, what, Scott? No, yeah, I don't know what are you, where, what are you, what are you on about, Scott? Wait a minute, Scott. I okay. So all kidding aside, I am making it to my 111th birthday, and you're all invited to my birthday party. So if I'm making it to 111, that's a lot more than 30 years from now. So, oh, absolutely. Are you kidding? You write that in stone, because by then, if you can't, we'll be able to holodeck you in. So, oh no, are you kidding? You're going to be here for the whole ride, watching the train wreck that is my life. Exactly. Exactly. Railroading. Here we go. We're getting there. So my next point here is the pervasively patronizing. They call it sandbox. Yeah, but they don't, because no self-respecting railroader would ever go off road. They still got to stay on the rails. Instead, the option to not railroad. Anyway, my point. I'm going to come back to that. But give me a couple seconds. The next one I have is pervasively patronizing attitude. If you read anything that Wizards of the Coast or Dungeons and Dragons has released in the last couple of years, they are talking down to us as players and game masters, saying we're the ones on high and we understand what you want, and here's what we're doing to provide for your needs. And that patronizing attitude, I've had enough. I don't need to hear uh, whatever the guy's name is. Yeah, exactly. It has nothing to do with anything, but it's the tone of it is, you can't do this without us. You can't. Well, yeah, yeah. Don't even get me started on shoes. But the idea of the VTT, you must use D&D Beyond. You know. Oh yeah, it's well, no, you can't. You can use it without, but then you're not using their VTT. You cannot. You will not be able to buy. You will not be able to buy the hard copy rule books without buying the electronic books. That's already a fact. Right. Yeah, exactly. No, and well, not only that, you won't want to. You won't want to, because theirs was going to be so dynamic that like I said, your players can have their hair wave in the wind, and they can see their spells being cast because the game icon will have that ability. That's all they think we players want. Exactly. There's only one I know. Exactly. And that's why I want to teach everybody how to play Totem, because when you play Totem, you can play anything. So, theater of the mind is the only way to go. Theater of the engaged mind. That's what Totem stands for. The next one. Right. But if you're doing it so that you're describing the location and describing what they have in their hands and describing how far apart they are and that kind of thing, then the theater of the mind engagement is when they are no longer saying, my character does this, but they're saying, I'm doing this because they are in the scene. You see, that's really the difference is that you're not pushing a piece on a board and telling me what that thing is doing. Instead, you're saying, "Well, I want to kidnap that cute little rabbit I saw, so I'm going to go over and grab him. Use my stealth or whatever, and I'm going to sneak up on him." You don't let him. You don't let him. You start with him. No, I'm telling you, you don't let him. If you want him to play theater of the mind, you have to make him first. So when you get ready with the scene description, turn to him. Don't talk to the others. You know he's the one that's the weakest. Give him the option first. And if he looks to anybody else, you say, "Wait a minute, this is you. What are you doing?" Because if you don't, if you don't, if you don't train them, if you don't train a player to think of themselves as being in the scene, they will never be in the scene. You will be constantly giving them free boosts and experience points because you're granting everybody else points, and you're going to be depriving them of the experience of true role play. Don't, don't. Yeah, but what I'm getting is you have to train. What I'm trying to get across to you is that you have to train yourself to push him first in the priority because he's the one who's least likely to make a decision. So make him make the decision. Make him make the decision first. And when he goes to defer, say, "Well, I don't know yet," and say, "I'm sorry, clock's ticking. You're the focus of this moment. What are you doing?" And then just shut up. Then you have to shut up and wait for his answer. Because if you don't, you're depriving him. Because what'll happen is he'll say, "Oh, I want to wait for that other guy," and then he'll let the other guy go. And then in his mind, he thinks you don't think he matters. So you have to. That's what I'm telling you. That's what I'm telling you. You have to make him the agent. You have to, at least for a while. Eventually, mm-hmm, right? Yep. Well, okay. You're never going to make a leader out of the non-leaders. Scott will tell you you can't make somebody non-lead. But no, you're not even going to do that. But you can at least get them to act. You got to get you. All you need is he needs to be in action. Needs to do a thing. And the reason why I say you can't make them lead is that Scott played with a gentleman who uh, remains nameless with us, but he was an advocate for, quote, Scott taking the lead of the group. And Scott didn't want to be the leader. Scott wanted to be the advisor, wanted to be a sage and a wise guy. That didn't mean I didn't put pressure on Scott to make decisions. Scott still had to be the one to act when I'd point to him, but his action was never something that others had to follow. You see what I'm saying? They could do what they wanted, but at least Scott was acting, and therefore, once you, right, right, right. The point is that don't give yourself the permission to let that guy ride somebody else's coattails. You've got to push him to act. Um, Right, right, and that's the reason why he zones out is he knows he can depend on the others. You just have to shake him up, and the only way you can do that is just until you get adequate responses from him on a consistent basis. Just ask him first. The other players know. The other players know what's going on. The ones who want to lead are more than willing to let him ride. And so when you put the pressure, they know what's going on. They're not going to interfere, but they know what you're doing. And so don't feel like you have to wait, to buckle. Mm-hmm. Cool. Just remember that until such time that he is adequately holding his own player, you have to make sure you focus on him from the standpoint of what goes first, because otherwise he will never see his own agency, because players intentionally or they are aware of what they think of as their status. The reason why I mentioned that in presence of Scott is that Scott knows that he often would prefer not to be the leader, but there are times when the situation kind of demands it. And so I put extra pressure on Scott when that happens. Isn't that right, Jed Jander? I did. Scott, did you copy that? Yeah. But my only point was that from the very beginning session that Jed Jander is supposed to be somewhat more aware than many other characters, just because you as a player have more experience with Nikos. So the players are going to look to you for leadership somewhat. And as time went by, there were a couple of pretty strong leaders that came on board. So now Jed's not feeling his position as much. So, but anyway, the attitude of the organization is horrible. But the next one is the worst, and that is the intentional streamlining of roleplay. If you don't see this, watch their product releases. This session this season, they want you fighting giants. So they release the Glory Hole adventures so that you will go and hunt down the glory of the giants. And that's telling you as a game master what stories you have to tell. And if that isn't railroading, I don't know what is. And they've been doing that since 5th edition. No, 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 no. It's not until the organization promotes it. In other words, there are 1,000 companies out there that produce modules. Not to mention mine, which is still available on Nycos on. Wow. He hasn't even read mine, but he's yeah. That's laugh now, monkey. Laugh now, monkey boy. That's funny, but no. What I'm saying is that when D&D went into 5th edition, the only released Tyranny of the Dragon Queen. That was the only module that was released. And they waited for almost a year before they released the next module. And what they've done with their release schedule is they are streamlining the players to get used to wanting what they're selling so that the game masters are forced to run what they are producing. And that is railroading by definition. Well, no, what I'm saying is that that's but if you're doing it rationally, you're producing as many different types as possible to engage as many different game masters as possible to get as many games. I If I have 10 modules out there and all 10 sell, I'm better off than if I make one module and only one sells. Because if I'm only selling one module and I'm selling to a game master, you're selling it to a game master like me, and you say, "Oh, Tyranid of Dragons is the only thing to run." No, you can get 12 other game masters that'll run that for you. I'm going to run something unique, and the players are going to flock to my game because they don't want to be railroaded either. So it's a fallacy to think that you have to do it this way. But the process that they've invented is intentionally streamlining game masters into being railroaders. Run the module as written. Follow the rules of the game as written. Make sure you stay within the lines, because that way you're a D&D game master and we own you. Mm-hmm. Well, and your players are going to react negatively because, quite honestly, the way they do it now, the players can go buy the module, read the module, and therefore they know what the encounters are going to be. And when you change out a monster, you upset them because they've already studied and trained to be playing in that module. Exactly. Yeah. Well, furthermore, the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, about Dungeons and Dragons and why I've left D&D as a franchise for NycosRPG is the obvious attempts at cash grabs, and they're not going to be what you think, but they are going to be Dungeons and Dragons, the Yahtzee set, Dungeons and Dragons, the Monopoly set, Dungeons and Dragons, the Diplomacy set, Dungeons and Dragons, the chessboard, Dungeons and Dragons, the that is so uncharacteristically unfair because they can mass produce and they can therefore swamp the marketplace